Hello, bookworms. Welcome to The Best Book Ever, the podcast where I get to know interesting people by asking them about their favorite books. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and today I'm talking to Jeremy Patlen. Take a deep breath now. Maybe you want to have a seat for this. The director of book buying for Colorado's world-famous Tattered Cover Bookstore. I know! I am still freaking out. Jeremy and I had a great time talking about the bookstore life, the artist life, and he even convinced me to listen to opera. All of these topics derived from the tender and sad and beautiful memoir, Just Kids, by Patti Smith, which Jeremy chose as his best book ever. Hi, Jeremy. Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Morning. Thanks for having me, Julie.
I'm so excited to talk to you because you work at what I call a destination bookstore, one of my favorite bookstores on the planet.
Yay.
One of my bucket list bookstores, which I have been fortunate to visit multiple times.
Oh.
But before we actually get to that, your bookstore life, I want to ask you about reading in general in your life. How did you become a reader?
I don't remember. I always had a book in my hand. I would always rather be reading. I grew up in a family in northern New Jersey, and only four of us, but we can create some volume. And I never, as a kid, I was smaller. I was more reserved. I don't know. I loved going to school. I didn't want to play sports, and I would always rather be reading. And I remember being a little kid, just trying to understand Shakespeare or reading the newspaper at the table. And I don't know, just always loved it. So,
were your parents readers?
Yeah, totally. My mom always had. I remember in that bedroom there was a wall-sized bookshelf. And she was always reading. She still does all the time. We trade books, as regularly as we can across the country. But my dad always liked monster books and vampires and horror and sci-fi, and well, not quite sci-fi. And my mom was a lot of fiction.
What kind of reader are you in your free time now?
That's a very good question, because with books as my job, it's never quite free time. But I do really prefer to read good fiction. I love literary fiction. I can read some trashy fiction. I really look right now for queer authors to try to understand what's going on in the world. But also with my job, I've got to make sure that I'm reading a completely representative arc of books out there, so I know what to recommend to our customers and what to bring into the store.
Tell my listeners what your job is.
I'm the director of buying at the Tattered Cover Bookstore in Denver, Colorado.
I just got
goosebumps. Me too. It's how it happened is circuitous and long, and we don't really need to go into all the details, but I love it. I find myself incredibly fortunate to be in a job that I care passionately about. And I've been working at the bookstore for about 6 years, and at bookstores for about 10 or so in general. The first job I had in one was managing the coffee shop at McNally Jackson in New York City, where I lived most of my adult life. And then we decided to move to Denver in about 2016. And that's when I discovered the Tattered Cover and started working there as a bookseller, then managed the coffee shops, and then came back when a buying job opened up. And then that's evolved into my current position. So
your clients, your customers who come in, do they tend to be looky-loos, or do you get real book lovers? Because I know it's considered a destination.
Yeah, all over the place. We have people that come in, certainly to our Colfax store, where you come and browse. It's too big to just. But we have people that come in, go right to the shelf, pick the two books that they're looking for, and leave. We do see trends with what authors sell better at what stores. What's fascinating right now is that we have a store at McGregor Square that we opened up back in May, I believe, after we closed our Lodo store back in March. Real estate conversation, rent too high, blah, blah, blah. We had a better deal. And we went to a slightly smaller space, but in a brand new building. I mean, the store is gorgeous. And the customer is pretty different than it was 4 blocks away. And I think it has something to do with, we're right across the street from Coors Field, and we're in a new residential complex with a big hotel in it. So we're getting a lot more people traveling from all across the country. And there's a bookstore right downstairs from their hotel. So they're popping in. It might not be a couple blocks away and they wouldn't know we're there. So it's really fascinating. Traditionally, our Aspen Grove store had a more conservative customer in the southern suburbs than the big city store of Cherry Creek does. But that's not to say that that customer doesn't exist within the same spheres, but we do buy differently for all of our different stores. It's fun. It's a puzzle, and it's a conversation that always, always evolves.
That's the other thing I really like about your stores is that I have met, your employees are not, they're not just sales clerks,
Not at all.
Yeah. Many times I have gone to your employees and said, what was the last great book you read? And their faces light up and they will take you to a back corner and go, okay, this one. And it's so fun.
It never, I'm continually amazed by the depth and breadth of knowledge by our book selling, by the entire staff of the store, actually. We turned 50 this year. So we've had a lot of people that still work back of house that have worked at the company for a long time. And just the things you learn on a daily basis and speaking with, especially with, well, I shouldn't say especially, and in speaking with the booksellers on the floor, everybody's got an opinion. Mm-hmm. Everybody reads. And for the most part, you don't choose to work in an independent bookstore, earning the vast sums that we all do, just because it's an available job. Most people that work in a bookstore do it because we love what we sell, right? Mm. We love reading. We want to be around them. There's a feeling and an open discourse in bookstores that doesn't exist in many other lines of work. One of the big projects I'm trying to work on, with all our free time, is to really revitalize our Shelf Talker program, because that's where you find out what the staff feels. And when I interview people for a new job, the first question I ask routinely is, when you walk into a new bookstore and you don't know anything about it, what's the first section you go to? And for me, it's the Shelf Talker section. What are the staff recommends? Like, what does the staff read? What does the store believe in? And because that's where the interest is, I find, for the store. And we're doing some really fun things. I mean, nothing revolutionary, but we're really trying to uplift staff recommends. Mm-hmm. And from a buying side, we're really trying to choose books as our books of the month, and then consequently our books of the year. Just books that we love for whatever reason, not because the publishers are pushing it or not because they're bestsellers, but that the one real caveat that I had when I sent out the request did it publish in 2021, and do you love it? And there are some big books going on there, big releases over the year. I mean, Intimacies by Katie Kitamura and Jumpha Lahiri's Whereabouts blew me away this year. Those are big releases with a lot of press. But then there are also some smaller books that came out that also, really, really enjoyed. Another one coming out, I think in November, is one called Comfort Me with Apples.
That's an old one, isn't it? Comfort Me with Apples? The Ruth Reichl book?
No, Comfort Me with Apples by Catherynne Valente is her name. Oh. Save Me the Plums was Ruth Reichl, because that was a great read.
But yes, it was. But I think her first
was it called Comfort Me? Was it the exact same?
I think so.
I'm looking it up right now. You're absolutely correct. It is the exact same.
How interesting.
And I love that. So I'm a fan of memoirs, and what I loved, it was either with that one or Save Me the Plums, where in her introduction, maybe it was with Comfort Me with Apples, where she said, these are my stories and these are my memories. They might not be exactly as they happened, but this is how I remember them. Yeah. And it's very, very, I really appreciated that admission when I read that.
Yes. So there's a new one that's coming out, you said,
Yes. It's I don't know if it's considered sci-fi, horror, or some kind of a fantasy, but it's a shorter book, but a pretty special one.
I love that it has the same title because it almost makes you think maybe it's going to be a little bit of a riff, like a jazz riff on. I wonder if there is going to be some food talk in this sci-fi comfort me with apples.
Oh, there is a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I'm going to read
it's an old story. It's an old story with a very new retelling.
Is it a Snow White?
It would be a spoiler.
Okay.
And that's the thing. Because it's, hold on. I think I have it right here, actually.
Ooh, that looks spooky. What a cover.
One of my favorite things, one of my our team's favorite things to do, like we judge books by their covers. So we get these boxes of ARCs that come in, and you can sometimes. And that cover, there are a number of books over the years. I was like, ooh, I want to read that. And
that's very intriguing. Whether they read a book a day or a book a year, I love asking people to tell me about their favorite books. And that includes you, dear listener. What's your all-time favorite? Your desert island classic? What about the childhood favorite that you still know by heart? The mystery that took you by surprise? The biography that changed your way of thinking? Or the book club favorite that you can't stop thinking about? I'm looking for guests from all walks of life to talk to me about all kinds of books here on the show. Go to my website, juliewroteabook.com, and click on the button that says, Be a Guest on the Best Book Ever. I'm really looking forward to talking to you. Now, back to the show. So, Jeremy, tell me, how did you first come across this book that you chose as your best book ever, Just Kids by Patti Smith?
My late great friend Ruth gave it to me one year for either Christmas or my birthday. And she was magnificent, in a word. I met her, I guess she was in her late 60s, and I was a recent college graduate in my early 20s, and we were introduced by a mutual friend. And I remember the first time we met, she asked me how old I was, and she said, "They still make people that age." And and she became my New York City Auntie Mame in a lot of ways. She was she had, like most interesting people, 3-4 different lifetimes over the course of her life. Again, I met her when she was in her late 60s, and I believe this was in about 1996 or 7 or 8 or somewhere in that time frame. And she had the Upper East Side apartment that was covered in art. Her career was in art. She knew artists all over the city. She had received her doctorate, I believe, from the School of Fine Arts in New York City after a divorce in the 1980s. And that's when she made her own money in the art world. And so to hear all of these stories from her over the years was just fascinating. And we became very, very, very good friends for quite a long time. Sadly, she passed recently.
I'm sorry.
She had a long and really historic life. She lived in London in the 1970s and had a black living room with a red racing stripe that was featured in Architectural Digest. Like, she had these stories and met these people. And I had always been an artistic person, but I was working in business at the time. I was working in retail at a off-price retail office job. Spreadsheets, blah, blah, numbers, blah, 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 blah. And it was such a great outlet for me to go to galleries with her and go to museums with someone who knew about all of these things and taught me. I'm also a photographer, have always kind of had a camera in hand and taking pictures and creating. And that's been my main medium over the years. And one year at Christmas, she, either Christmas or my birthday, they're both in the winter, birthday's in February. She gave me this book and she said, "Something tells me you're going to love this." And it blew me away. And it, not to sound trite, but I had mentioned I had worked in business, numbers. And at this point in my life, I was somewhere in my late 30s and I was miserable. I hated it. I had never questioned it. I went to Middlebury College in rural Vermont, and I was a French literature major there back in the day. And so I went from that. And after college, I kind of assumed I was going to go do some kind of grad school and go the academic route. But it never panned out that way. I wound up living in New York all these years, found a job, met a boy, blah, blah, blah. And life happened. And I didn't really question it until I was in about my mid to late 30s and just was miserable in my job and didn't have a vocabulary to describe it. And then I read this book, and within a year of reading it, this was one of the things that gave me the courage to walk away from my corporate life and try something that was going to make me happy.
Wow. That's quite the effect of a book.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people thought I was brave. I was a little bit foolish, but I had a small side hustle as a photographer, family photo shoots, weddings, things like that. And I was doing okay with it. And I was like, okay, I can focus on that now. And, I not to be tacky, and we don't talk about money, but I got my annual bonus, and it was enough for me to live off of for a couple of months without working, and say, okay, I have this amount of money. I can pay my credit card, I can pay my rent, pay food, and not change my life for a couple of months. And then let's focus on the photography. And thank God I had my wonderful husband's support. And I took a couple of weeks off for the first time as an adult, just didn't do anything. And then, of course, when your entire life is structured, it's really hard to create that when you don't know what you're doing. And so after about 2 months of, anxiety, wallowing, working, trying to not knowing what to do, I was like, I need a part-time job. And that's when, through connection, I had got an interview at McNally Jackson and started working there of all places. And then, the rest is history.
Why don't you describe what this book is about for my listeners who perhaps haven't come across it yet?
This book is about life, love, art, and dedication. And I don't know how else to say it. It's so simplistic, but and beauty. How could I forget beauty? Because despite everything that happened to both of these main protagonists, my God, is there a sense of beauty to both of their lives and purpose, and almost an innate goodness in a way to both of them that you would never necessarily understand just from their art. But when you look into it, both their people and their art, it makes total sense. From my entire sort of education and upbringing and my own education in art, Robert Mapplethorpe was always one of the most extraordinary figures. I mean, as a queer photographer, I was like, when I first saw this stuff back in the day, I was blown away by it on every level. And then, the first time I ever heard Patti Smith's line, from the opening of Gloria, Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. It's like, yes, yes. And I grew up in a pretty Catholic household in northern New Jersey, in a predominantly Italian American family. And, we went to church on Sunday, and I went to a Catholic high school and, raised super Catholic. And then I never knew until I read this book of their shared connection, because I really liked both of their work, but didn't know much about their personal stories. And then to hear it or to read it written with such dignity and grace and beauty, but also that punk just fuck it. This is what it is that makes us love Patti Smith so much.
She was always a little scary to me.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. And this book to me is so tender. And the title, Just Kids, is so perfect, because reading it at my age, at 52, I kept they're just kids.
They're just kids. No, I'm 47. I understand. I think of myself at that age.
As you have reread this in these days, do you go back and look at their art again and reconsider it after reading this book?
Oh, of course I did. I've been rereading it over the past week, for our conversation. And On one side of my desk, I had Patti Smith, and on the other side, I had my Robert Mapplethorpe photo book. The big tome called The Photographs, I believe.
She says at one point, when she looks at the pictures of her taken by him, by Robert Mapplethorpe, she doesn't see herself. She sees the two of them. Their bond is so fascinating and beautiful.
And it is, and that's why this whole book works so well, that they had that bond, and she had what I keep obsessing over is how little they had, how little they kept, especially Patti Smith, and that she clearly, in her most treasured books that she talked about, kept her journals and her diaries, and she kept records of all of these years. From a photographer's point of view, I've often said, and I find this was clearly part of his genius, especially in portraiture, my photographs of people are only as good as my session or my relationship with them. Another thing that I thought about, and I don't remember where I read this, or I doubt I came up with it, but the word photography, the Greek, the roots of the word, writing with light. And so you can't create a photo in the absence of light. And so especially with still life, it matters greatly what you place where you place the light, where the shadows are coming from, what's highlighted, what's not. It's amazing how much you can draw, you can write with light.
I did not know that you were a New Yorker or former New Yorker. So this now I really want to ask you this. The book is so evocative of New York.
It's got to be one of the reasons why I love it too.
Well, I'm sure. But given the internet has democratized so much of what we have access to, but do you think it has also destroyed those artistic communities? Do you think there are any places that still have that vibrant, concentrated areas of artists anymore? Or do you think it's just all people can live anywhere and be an artist in any suburb?
I've never thought about it in that lens, but I don't know. There's a part of me that believes that when you're with your community and when you're with your people, you have a much freer exchange of information and creative juice flow, so to speak, than you do in your own little bubble out in the suburbs. Sure, you can be connected, but you're not sitting over a canvas together. You're not in the same room taking photographs of each other. You're not smoking weed and taking your shirts off and painting on each other and seeing what happens when you put paper on that. And, I know Patti Smith moved out to the far Rockaways of New York and had a little beach shack, or like a smaller house out by in the Rockaways. And I don't remember the quote exactly when, I might be wrong. So please, let's verify this. But she said a number of years ago, New York is dead for for young artists. It's no longer really feasible. Go to Pittsburgh, go to Detroit, go to other cities. Being there in those years when you have the creative flow and you work at places like, oh, let's talk about this. And then a coworker says, oh, let's collaborate on this and let's take some photos. And, or a friend of mine was like, hey, I need headshots for this play that I'm doing, which leads to other things. And you need that concentrated, that concentrated artistic community is a symbiotic relationship. And it's its own kind of atmosphere, or what's the word I'm looking for? Ecosystem, where it's that creative energy that connects people, no matter what the medium.
There is a very I did not flag it, but there is a very specific moment in here where I think she's talking about Janis Joplin, and she says something, and then Patti Smith even makes the comment, so that happened in front of me, but I was 20, I didn't notice, or something like that. And it boggled my mind. You were sitting there with the giants, and you were also a giant yourself.
But she was so wrapped up in her own thoughts.
Yes, exactly. That's what she says. She's thinking about her love life, as we all are when we're 20. But you're right. Then she took that conversation and brought it into her own work, and it it couldn't have happened if she and Janis Joplin were Facebook messaging each other. It would
No,
not be the same work.
no, it wouldn't. I really love the ability for me to work from home from time to time.
Sure.
But I prefer working with my team in the office.
But I really feel like we're moving away from that. And it's going to be really interesting to see where the art world goes.
Yeah. And they've been talking, in the newspapers, they were talking for years, like Berlin was the new city in art, and all the new things in the early aughts. And now, they're talking about Kiev kind of being the new version of Berlin from kind of there was a fascinating piece in the New York Times last weekend about it's like the pandemic party capital. And they don't want to be known as the new Berlin because, we're Kiev, we're not Berlin. But kind of that center has always moved around.
Are there any American cities that are open like that, do you think, that are very artistically inclined? I mean, Denver has its fair share, wouldn't you say?
We do. We have lots of galleries, but Denver's not cheap. A couple years ago, you were able to rent a 2-3 bedroom apartment for $1,000 or a 2-bedroom apartment for $1,000 a month. And a 1-bedroom is $500 a month. And you can have a job at a bookstore and pay your rent and have a decent life. You might not be able to go to Europe every year, but you'd be able to afford life and be happy and be calm. And that's what I find that as an artist, what I need is a sense of security. And ironically enough, that's one of the things Robert Mapplethorpe wanted too.
Yeah.
He needed that financial security. If I can't pay my rent, I'm not going to be able to create. It's not going to, creating art under pressure that generally doesn't, bode well for me personally.
Were there any particular stories in this that hit you especially hard?
Yeah, it really, there are so many moments of it that just takes your breath away, either from the beauty of the writing or the devastation of what's happening.
Yes.
His dying of AIDS.
Oh God.
That last paragraph, that makes me that, that it's very difficult for me to read as a gay man of a certain generation that came out at the tail end of the AIDS crisis in the middle to late. I came out in 1993. It was a very different time than now. I remember sections of, I'm that bridge generation that just at the very end of it, people were still dying, but new drugs were becoming available. But it was still scary as hell. And it still really bothers me. And it's not comfortable for me to read that.
It really brings home what we have lost in terms of a generation of artists.
My goodness. Yeah.
Because an
entire generation
gone. And what if he were alive and Patti Smith's age? God only knows what he would have done artistically. And I don't know that that's something we've reckoned with as a country, that we have literally lost a generation of men who are not producing the art that we by rights as a culture, we should have this art.
And of course, it was incredibly politicized.
Yes.
It took Reagan how many years just to admit that it was going on, and then it was stigmatized, and it still is in many quarters. Well, what about you? You mentioned there were a couple of moments that.
Well, the fact that she had her last interactions with both Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, literally right before they both died.
Yes.
And they were both such tender and sweet and kind. The one with Jimi Hendrix just brought me to tears. And I'm not a huge Jimi Hendrix fan, but that was another one that just made me go, God damn it. Why don't we get these people? Why couldn't Jimi Hendrix live to his 90s?
No. And that aspiration to create a new language based on music and peace, like to have those thoughts and then to die before even being able to, again, I agree with you. I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of music from that age. Just the sound of it. It's not what I've listened to over the years. there's no doubting his musical genius and what he would have been able to accomplish all these years later.
Right.
Good God.
It's when we lose artists, I feel like we really lose a lung almost of our culture.
Mhm.
And it's
and we lost a generation especially in the art world in New York City, which at the time was creating most of the newer art in the country. But it's devastating to think about.
So you have not read any of her poetry?
Oh, I have. I've
You have?
No, and I've read some subsequent works of hers as well. Wool Gatherings, I have. M Train. Oh, that was a devastatingly sad book, but that was her reflections on her late husband. And my understanding of it anyway. And what's the other great one? Devotions was also a wonderful Patti Smith read.
I have no experience with their poetry at all, but now after reading this, I do. And I'm not much of a poetry reader, but I think I would like her. Yeah.
I loved poetry. In high school, of all things, I remember having to read poems for school, but then college kind of destroyed me with it. I was a French literature major, and the French school of studying poetry back in the day, I remember having to write papers and count syllables and sometimes letters and, really analyze it to the point of not enjoying it anymore, where I just wanted to read it for the beauty of the language. And so it got me off of it for a while. But over the past, I've been dipping into some more poetry over the past couple of years, and there's some fascinating stuff. There's some really beautiful work coming out.
And this book makes you want to pick up other books and understand how artists draw from each other.
And especially musicians, in my mind, because, lyrics are a form of poetry. I mean, how do you define poetry, right? I actually I've never thought about that. Like, what's if you go to the dictionary, what's the definition for poetry? I don't know. But for me, it's sort of, using language to tell a story that's not necessarily in a linear and grammatical form, right? You have absolute freedom with your words, with where you can put them on a page, with the order of your syntax, and you can move everything around and create kind of a new language. And then for songs, you accentuate that with music. And then you get into one of my true loves in life, which is actually opera, of all things.
How'd you get into that?
So the friend that introduced me to my friend Ruth, his name is John, Ruth gave me this book, introduced me to opera when I was in college. He was a professor. He invited me over for dinner one night. I said, "What is this we're listening to?" He's like, "It's Aida." I said, "Okay, tell me more." And I went to my first performance at the Metropolitan Opera in October 1997. I went over 200 times in the years that I lived there.
Oh my God.
Well, if you sat upstairs 3 feet from God in the really cheap seats for a while, like the seats were $25 a pop. And so for that, you're in a 4,000 seat theater. You need binoculars to see the stage, but Jesus Christ, that sound is fucking beautiful up there. And if you're sitting right in the middle at the top at Carnegie Hall as well, it's like you're wearing headphones to the stage. There's this insane thing that happens. And to hear those unamplified voices, cresting sometimes 100-piece orchestra with poetry and stories.
Do you feel that you need to know it well before you go to the opera?
It is an incredibly great question. And my absolute answer is no. You don't need to do anything before going into it in depth. It helps to know a little bit of the plot. The more you know about opera, the more you tend to enjoy it, because it's at its base, it's live theater. And so you have very few people around the world that can actually sing these roles in a way to be able to sing them on the main stages of the world. And so you have, and there are new pieces that come out, but there is a standard repertory. And so you'll have the same singer that's singing Aida here and a different singer singing it in Chicago or New York or Paris, or the same singer singing that same role over the course of a 20, 30, 40-year career, with different understandings of the role over different parts of their lives. And so it's really fascinating to compare and contrast. And I like this person's voice better. And the more you know, the more you tend to enjoy it. And that's where the obsessive fandom comes into play. But if you were going to go to your first opera and see it, there are certainly operas I would recommend more than others, because for me, a 5 hour night at the Met of, slow plodding, very like Don Carlo, I want more. And then a lot of people are like, okay, I'm falling asleep. I'm tired of this. But if you start someone on a shorter 2.5 to 3 hour night, like a Puccini's La Boheme or Madame Butterfly, with a much more understandable story and the swelling orchestra and all the emotions, that's how it would be much more easily palatable and digested. But then there are like 90-minute shockers like Richard Strauss's Salome, and a lot of the plots are sex, power, murder. Why do these stories still matter? Sometimes hundreds of years after they've been written. And I think that the plots sort of speak to a deeper human truth or an emotion that is easily translated across ages and different story frames.
Well, let me ask you,
Sure.
What are you reading these days?
Right now I'm listening to My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. He's a local, Stephen Graham Jones is his name. He lives in Colorado, and I don't know his other work. A lot of my coworkers love it, and I've started listening to this, and I love it. It's kind of a slasher flick and a novel.
Yeah, I've seen it, but I'm a little scared of it. Is it a scary book?
It is, but it's really good. I've been listening to it. So I'm one of those insufferable distance runners, and I'm training for a marathon now. And so when I have 2-3 hours to run, sometimes I listen to music, which is all over the board. But oftentimes I'm like, oh, let me get through a chunk of a novel. And it's a good one to run to. So I'm listening to that. Harlem Shuffle and Beautiful Country is a new memoir that's out right now. And that's pretty stunning as well. She tells this story with such a clinical simplicity that it sort of makes the horrors that she lived through even more acute. To be an undocumented Chinese immigrant in New York in the 1990s, I can't imagine what that was like. And then these stories, like, this is the same city I lived in at the same time. Whoa, reality check, And then, I've got a couple arcs on my desk for books coming out in the spring that I'm trying to get through as well.
That must be a fun part of your job.
It really, really is. It feels like Christmas every day we get those boxes. In fact, that's what we call it. Like, let's have Christmas morning. But some of the ones I've read recently, The Inheritance of Orchidea Divina was a really fun one. Zoraida Cordova is the author's name. She did some YA books, to my understanding, and it was our book of the month last month. So I listened to it, and it was a really, really great book. Lots of kind of magical realism. My favorite novel of all time is Love in the Time of Cholera. I am a sucker for big, gooey, romantic stories. And this is in that kind of magical, realistic realm of I guess. Maybe not at this, it was a really, really great read. I really enjoyed it. And what else? Fuzz by Mary Roach was a lot of fun.
She's always so good.
Yeah, that just dropped 2 weeks ago, I think.
Yeah.
And then Emily St. John Mandel's new book coming out in the spring kind of blew me away. Sea of Tranquility, it's called. Post-pandemic, deals with pandemics. And then the other newer book that I loved and I've read cover to cover was Colm Toibin's new one, The Magician.
He wrote Brooklyn, right?
Yes.
Is he that? Okay, so The Magician. Yeah. Tell me what that's about.
Imagined life of the German author Thomas Mann's experience from when he was a kid in northern Germany to when he was in exile at the end of World War II. It's a pretty thick book. I think it's one of the 500-page novels, and I read every page of it. It kept me going. Yeah, really fascinating. Talks a lot about the intellectualization of ethics in times of great change in war and what it meant for him to be German and to what extent his homosexuality or bisexuality had anything to do with his family, his writing, his experience. It hit a lot of really interesting points. And it was the first book of his that I read as well. And it really got my brain going. I can go on. Sally Rooney's newest one. I loved it. And at the risk of sounding old, like it didn't make me feel old when I read it, because oftentimes I try to read a lot of the novels written by the 20-somethings and 30-somethings and like, okay, cool. And without wanting to be too much of a dick, like I remember feeling that way too. And then with a little bit of space and a little bit of, prioritization, or however we want to word it, she's got a lot of really great insight in this book. And there's a lot of thought in this book, and a lot of just, it felt very real to me.
I cannot tell you how much fun this has been. I hope you will come back to the show anytime you have a book you want to talk to me about. Jeremy, would you please share with my listeners where they can find you online, besides visiting the best bookstore in the world?
And that's Tattered Cover. And that's tatteredcover.com in Denver, Colorado. I have a personal website, jeremypatlen.com, JeremyPatlen. And that is my photography and my stories over the years. And as I was trying to continue to do photography as a side hustle and for my own passion, I've been told over the years, you have too much on your website. You have too much on your... Well, enjoy. I have almost every country I've ever visited, travels for the past couple of years, series I've done. I keep it up. Those are my stories. That's how I've documented my life over the years, not necessarily with the journals I wish I would have kept after doing this, but the places I've been and the people I've seen. So that's my website. And then I'm instantly findable on Instagram or Facebook as well.
I want to thank you for joining me today. It has been so wonderful talking to you, and I hope you will come back anytime you want to talk books with me.
Don't threaten me with a good time.
Thanks for listening, bookworms. For more information on this episode and links to all the books we discussed, go to our website, bestbookeverpodcast.com. You can also follow the podcast on Instagram at Best Book Ever Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and you can find me everywhere as Julie Wrote a Book. If you loved this episode as much as I loved making it, why not leave a review wherever you're listening? Each review helps new listeners find my work, and I'm so grateful for your help. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you at the library. Okay, my TBR. This is what happens when I talk to booksellers. I hang out.
Sorry.
Order everything.
Yeah.